This is Jon Faine on ABC Radio Melbourne.
8 minutes to 10 on Known Unknowns. Coming up after 10 o'clock, we're going to have a look at this amazing Belt and Road initiative that China are bringing in, where they're going to run freight and through trains and rail lines and infrastructure all the way from China across to Europe in what we're told is the single biggest commitment of infrastructure any country's ever made any time ever in the world. It's like a sort of mechanised Silk Road.
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns.
5 minutes past 10, and Uncle Donald Rumsfeld reminds us on a Wednesday that there's stuff we don't really know that much about. And in order to understand stuff better, we invite people who know stuff to come in and teach us things. Today we thought we would have a close look at what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. China have announced to the world that they are going to transform global trade. They are building what's said to be the biggest infrastructure project anyone has ever tried anywhere, which will transform global trade. Belt and Road is the subject of Known Unknowns today. Michael Bachelard is investigations editor with The Age newspaper. You might have seen their double-page special report in today's edition. He's generously agreed to follow it up by coming in and being our guest on Known Unknowns today. And Michael, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Belt and Road for beginners, please.
Well, as you've said, a massive infrastructure project. It stretches from, it sort of radiates out from China. The maps differ. It's difficult to tell exactly what it is. And a bunch of stuff that was probably going to happen anyway has been rolled in under the brand name. That said, there's dozens of ports that China has either invested in, bought or built in countries around the world, from Pakistan through to Africa, down the east coast of Africa, into the port of Piraeus in
Greece.
Yep, massive port
where all the ferries go in and out for the islands.
That's right, and which they want to make a real hub for goods coming into and out of Europe and through into China. So that's what they call, confusingly, the maritime part of it is called the road. The belt is a massive overland section of highways, rail particularly, spreading out, as I say, all the way through Eurasia into Europe. There's now dozens, I think 60 trains a week going into Europe from China.
So this is through the stands, some of the most inhospitable territory, both physical and political terrain imaginable.
Absolutely, they're building rail within Europe as well. So they're rebuilding the Belgrade to Budapest rail route, which ultimately is designed to join up with the port of Piraeus. They've got ambitions to build a train line right down the east coast of Malaysia and into Singapore. So it's almost inconceivable, the scale of this thing.
So what they're doing is kind of making China the centre of all the spokes of the wheel, like the hub of the wheel, so that all roads lead to their factories.
Well, the old Roman Empire saying has occurred to me in the writing of this. It used to be said that all roads lead to Rome. All roads are now leading to China. We had a really good opinion piece, I thought, today in The Age, where Richard McGregor from the Lowy Institute points out that the Americans, despite what's happening in the South China Sea, still kind of maintain dominance of the oceans to the east of China. But China's really trying to dominate economically the area between it and Asia to the west, and also to the south. So all those maritime choke points, the Malacca Straits, the Suez Canal and so on, they are buying or building port facilities around there. And the ultimate ambition of this goes, if you look north, through the Arctic. And global warming means that the Arctic sea ice is starting to melt, and that within the next 20 to 30 years we could conceivably see regular and reliable sea routes opened up through the Arctic. The Chinese are there. They're making deals with the Russians for exploitation of routes, ports and resources along the way, and they've got, I've read it, they've got an Arctic policy, and that would cut out a whole bunch of those choke points if they could take the Northern Passage. So the ambition of this is astounding.
1300 222 774. What do you think it means, dare I say it somewhat parochially, for us. Australia is not part of this grand plan. It's about linking up Asia to Europe. Along the way, that opens up access to Africa, which is seen by China to be a massive emerging cheap labour force. And already China is investing enormously in railways throughout Africa in the same way as they're building infrastructure like ports throughout the Pacific region, which is thought to be to do not so much with trade because there's so few people, but more to do with defence. But in Africa, it's about trade as much as anything. Indeed, there are people in Africa saying that they're being colonised by China. 1300 222 774 is the number. Now, I do, Michael, have a little bit of experience of some of these countries because some 10 years or so ago, I drove from Melbourne to London along the Silk Road. So we basically drove from our front gate up to Mongolia, to Ulaanbaatar, and turned left. And that took us along much of the terrain that's being described as Belt and Road. These are countries that are notoriously corrupt, notoriously ungovernable.
That's right.
Extraordinarily tribal still in their social arrangements. By and large, incredibly poor. And the word democracy has not yet quite made its way through the valleys, the tunnels, the mountain passes, and the inhospitable terrain. Doesn't seem to trouble China. None of that seems to be a problem.
So this is really fascinating. The World Bank says there's an $8 trillion infrastructure gap in parts of the developing world.
$8 trillion.
So the Belt and Road is projected to be worth about $1 trillion. But who knows? Some people say it's that $8 trillion. So clearly there is a massive need for infrastructure. And the way we in the West do infrastructure is we wait for the need to emerge and then we kind of backfill. The Chinese do it a different way. They build up front, which means they get a lot of white elephants and a lot of wasted money. But it also means that when the economic growth is ready to happen, there's infrastructure there to carry it. So there's roads to take your goods out into these inhospitable areas.
Not just roads, I can describe to you. When you approach some of these land borders, whether it's Mongolia, well, in fact, starting on our trip, it was entering China down near Kunming at the Laotian border, Laos, and it's jungle. On the Laos side of the border, you are driving for hours on a dirt, potholed, single-lane road full of bridges that are falling apart and look as if they're not going to carry the weight of even your own car, let alone a truck. There'll be chickens and goats and all sorts of things on the road and little bamboo stalls selling you everything from snakes in whiskey that you're told will do wonders for your manhood and all this sort of stuff. And you get to the Laos side of the border and there's quite literally the border post is a shack. And, it'd fall over in a decent wind and there's a bloke who you have to wake up in a pair of pyjamas who sort of doesn't quite know where his little rubber stamp is for your documents. And then you hit the border. On the China side, there is a not 2, not 4, but 6-lane highway with street lighting and 5-storey buildings. Guards by the dozen guarding nothing. There's not another single vehicle in sight. You are the only people likely to be passing through there that day, but that hasn't stopped them building 5-storey buildings, rows of shops with no customers, street lighting, almost processions for absolutely no obvious reason.
Yeah. And
then the same in Mongolia, and the same when we saw it out on the west and the border with to the west with Kyrgyzstan. It's extraordinary.
What an incredible image. And so I guess Belt and Road, you were there 10 years ago?
Exactly 10 years ago we set off, yeah.
So Belt and Road really was commissioned in 2013 and the idea of it is to extend that road into Laos.
Now, the border to Mongolia, you're driving for hours on a superhighway without another vehicle present or visible anywhere on either side of a 6-lane freeway.
Yeah.
And we assumed back then that the real purpose of that road was for military vehicles to be able to make a rapid connection. But in fact, it's much more ambitious even than that.
Well, yes, except that all of these things do have a dual purpose. If you build a port in Vanuatu, then you can send cruise ships there and increase Chinese tourism. and you can send a military ship there as well.
Especially if you've bought it like you have in Darwin.
Well, indeed, that's right. You asked earlier, what does it mean for Australia? And the Darwin port has been bought by a Chinese Belt and Road enthusiast, a company called Landbridge, with the enthusiastic help and endorsement of a former Trade Minister, Andrew Robb. But I think the Australian government kind of realised after that, I think they were taken a bit surprised by that, they realised after that what was going on and they've backpedalled. So the Australian government now, and Julie Bishop during the week gave an interview to our reporter David Rowe, expressing extreme scepticism about Belt and Road and its motives in the Pacific. So Australia is, I think, fair to say, still formulating its position on this. Steve Chobo was a lot more favourable to it in comments I heard this morning. So it's very much a kind of who's the Trade Minister. So
yes, and yesterday the ambassador saying that Australia has to move on from the Cold War mentality that some people are still locked into.
Yes, and saying that the fears that Australia holds about sovereignty in the Pacific are ridiculous. So we're grappling with quite an epochal event here. It really, in a sense, I think. Well, the key question here is it economic infrastructure? Are they building much needed infrastructure? Or is it a kind of an empirical takeover, sort of either soft, hard or sharp power takeover? And I think it's probably a bit of both.
Both, yes. They're not mutually exclusive.
That's right. But what it really does is it expresses Xi Jinping's desire to end the Chinese policy that's been in place for a long time, which is to keep your heads down, bide your time. That was a foreign policy that was kind of enunciated in 1990. At the most recent Chinese Congress, he said, that's finished. We're entering into the world now, and we're seeing it happen before us. So
we have Vladimir Putin saying, I will make Russia great again. We have Donald Trump saying, I will make America great again. And China is saying, it's our time. This is now the return of our empire. And we're not just looking to the future, we're looking into eternity and saying we are ready now to resume our proper and rightful place as a leading civilization.
Yes, after what they describe as the century of humiliation.
Yes, yeah. We've been forced through circumstance and military defeat into an unsustainable period of quietness. We're just now getting back to what we regard as normal. That's right. And with 1.4 billion people, massive industrial capacity, massive and growing technological capacity. Look, we're trying to build a 5G network, and who are the main bidders? They're Chinese companies. So it really is. It's an epochal change. 1300 222 774. 1300 222 774. Yes, China have got control of the port of Darwin, but they insist that that's just for them a business decision and an investment. Chinese Communist Party always has had the will to expand and push, and now they have massive amounts of money. Global domination, not just economically, says Gendel from Johanna. When the sleeping giant woke up, it found it needed a bigger belt, and we have to be careful. Some saying will be the biggest loser. Railway networks are how you move tanks and infantry divisions quickly. Keep that in mind. And there was another one I can't find. It's gone too far back in the past, but there we go. There are lots of people who are interested in this from a whole lot of different perspectives. Someone who said, here it is, just found it. I've just got home from Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and saw the Belt and Road infrastructure. It is opening up those countries. And says this text, it's just gone into refresh. It's opened up these countries with badly needed infrastructure. It's Bev from Avondale Heights. I did find you, Bev. It took me a while, and I'm sorry about that. Gillian in East Melbourne. Morning, Gillian. You're through to Michael Bachelard.
Yes, good morning. Last year we were in Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and the Chinese have been negotiating with the Nicaraguan government for a couple of years to try and open up a new canal to compete with the Panama on the grounds that even the new arm of the Panama Canal is not large enough to be able to take the super tankers that the Chinese are building in the future. I hadn't heard about this in Australia. I have read nothing about it in the media. Is there any information that you can add to this negotiation?
I'm afraid your knowledge on that is better than mine, Gillian.
Yeah.
But I can say that while most of the maps of Belt and Road sort of don't include either the Pacific or the Americas, that South America is very much in the target zone, and so is the Pacific. So we've seen Panama. I'm not going to start naming them because I'll get them wrong, but there are a number of countries have signed on. A number of countries in that, or at least one country in South America, has switched their allegiance from Taiwan to China, and this is another aspect of some of these things. 6 of the nations that support Taiwan are in the Pacific, and they're definitely, I think, in the target zone. And think about it, if at the moment Australia's iron ore trade with China is very much predicated on both quality of our iron ore and proximity to China. One of the pipe dreams in the Belt and Road is a rail line from west to east of the South American continent, which would allow them then to ship iron ore virtually unimpeded across the Pacific, as opposed to having to go around the other way. So that, I think, is in China's mind as well.
Well, it was interesting because the Nicaraguans, the general population was against it, and also about the feasibility of building a canal through a massive lake system, which has actually got active volcanoes in it. But the Chinese engineers are stating that they can actually do this.
Oh,
and I'm just amazed we haven't heard more about it.
Volcanoes are just a sort of passing irritation, really,
well,
aren't they?
That's what we were just amazed about. But they actually took land from the Costa Rican government, which doesn't have an army, and that's been resolved in the Hague, and there's supposed to have been compensation paid, because the Chinese are claiming that if they build a canal through Nicaragua, they must have 50-kilometre sovereignty of the land towards the north and the south of the canal. That was what we were told by these guides, these people in Nicaragua, all of whom were completely against the development. But by having a canal linking from east to west, north of the Panama, they were going to cut off so much precious time in the transit and, of course, a lot of cost.
So just to clarify, Gillian, the people you met were against it, but the government's for it.
Correct, because it was going to give them an enormous amount of money.
Yeah.
The Nicaragua is a third world country, really, still in development, agricultural, very little industry. And when you actually look at the map, there's a river that borders Nicaragua, Costa Rica, goes into a massive lake system, and then it's not very far from the end of that lake across into the Pacific Ocean.
Wow. So
in viability, it's easier to build than the Panama. But the Chinese are requesting the sovereignty. Now, these are all facts that we were told. I didn't have anything on paper.
No,
and there's been absolutely nothing in the media, we were gobsmacked.
You learn a lot from that sort of travel. It's fascinating, and Central America is a bit of a mystery to me, Michael.
Yes, and it's not something, and I am the foreign editor of The Age, so that is also, and so it's probably my fault that you haven't read anything, but we don't in Australia pay much attention to South and Central America.
We don't. Peter in Port Melbourne, welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, great article, Michael, yesterday's Age. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
There have been about 7 world empires, starting with Egypt and coming through today to the Anglo-American world empire. Now, we benefited from that empire, even though it was achieved by the British going into places like India, Hong Kong, New Zealand, using gunboat diplomacy and brutal methods. Now, why should we criticise China for doing the same as the British did to give us the benefit of today when they're doing the same by peaceful economic means?
Okay.
Well, it's a good question, and I don't think we can. I think the methods by which the British Empire were built were appalling, including in this country. The colonisation of this country, the methods by which sometimes the American empire has held on to power by sponsoring rogue regimes and keeping dictators in power and so on, have at times been appalling. So, as you say, all empires at times behave badly. I think what we should be watching out for here is that China is not a liberal democracy. We are a liberal democracy, and we have certain values and certain kind of ways of using power and accepting that power is used.
Playing by the rules, Julie Bishop called it yesterday.
A rules-based order that we are very much keen on keeping, because Australia benefits from a rules-based order. If an authoritarian state that oppresses its own people and free speech in its own country is to be a big new colonial player, then I think it's something we need to think very carefully about.
Text messages: the second aircraft carrier has just been launched or started by China. I think the first one's been launched, the second one has been started. The Nicaraguan canal permits much larger boats because it requires no locks, so there's no change of level. It was rejected originally because it was a much longer route when the Panama Canal was built. Don't forget, the Americans created Panama as a country so they could control the canal zone. The Chinese ambassador, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? For Australia, it means it's better to have an alliance with China and dump the alliance with Donald Trump's America, says Jen. And there's a fair bit of racism coming through. I'm not going to read out racist texts. I mean, you can send them if you want to, but it's a waste of your time, your money. Bit of waste of my time, but I can put up with that too. Chinese expansion is probably good for those countries it's building in, but not so good for everybody else, including us. And don't forget, China has 5 cities each with the same population as the whole of Australia, and that is just their urban centres. So yes, it is a huge country. Jake in the city, good morning to you, Jake. Hello, Jake. Last call. Jake. No, okay, we'll see what we can do about that. Nigel in Cheltenham, morning to you.
Morning, John. Look, you've already been discussing it sort of briefly. The elephant in the room when we're talking about Chinese investment in Australia is the fact that the dictatorship is the law. So there is no transparency. There is no real rule of law. It's whatever the dictatorship makes up at the time. So when it comes to companies like Huawei or other large Chinese investment companies and other agricultural companies, etc., they cannot be trusted in the long run, because the rules can change. There is no transparency. You'll never know who actually owns the company in the end, because they won't tell you.
You find that a negative, Nigel. There are people who think that's a positive. They find democracy to be irritating, unreliable and unpredictable, and they point to Donald Trump as exhibit number 1.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump can be voted out. The current president for life is not voted out. And hopefully Donald Trump will either be removed from office before 2020 or he'll be voted out of office in 2020. He may do damage along the way. He may cause concerns around the world along the way, which he is doing. But at least America has a process whereby they can remove such a person. There is no such process in China.
Well, that's absolutely right. You mentioned transparency. The transparency of these projects, one of the reasons it's difficult to research is that unlike the World Bank and other kind of institutions of the global economy, the Chinese banks don't report on the projects that they're doing, how much they've cost, how much interest they're charging, where the debt's laid, and so on. And their dealings with foreign governments are opaque. So we saw the Papua New Guinea Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer Charles Abel saying yesterday that yes, they're taking Chinese money for aid, but there are some concerns about how they want to spend that and use that.
There's no reason they shouldn't take aid from China, like they take aid from anywhere else.
No, quite right. But if it comes with a coercive strings attached. Now, our aid comes with strings attached too. We say when we give aid to Pacific countries, let's give you this money, but you need to make sure that you upgrade your public service so that we can see that it's transparent and so on. Now,
what we usually say is that you will buy our lamb or our beef, or you will buy our rice.
But our aid, well, that's true, but let's be friends as well. So there is a quid pro quo, and most countries use aid as kind of a foreign policy objective. But there are also sort of there are strings attached that we try to get transparency and so on in the public sector. It's not clear what strings are attached to some of this Chinese money, and in fact we've had stories recently about the company ZTE, the telecoms company, having institutionalised bribery, divisions of the company to pay off the leaders of these countries and so on in order to get ZTE infrastructure chosen over other bidders.
What do you think? There's corruption in Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and the like.
Well, one of the reasons that
really,
yeah, I know you're amazed, John, but it is one of the reasons that these countries have been difficult for Western companies and Western governments to act in, and the Chinese government doesn't have the same qualms.
Bob in Taradale. Morning, Bob.
Good morning, guys. Look, I haven't read the article, but I'm very, very interested in what you've been saying. Look, a bit of tongue-in-cheek here. We've been waiting 20-odd years for a rail out the Tullamarine Airport. Why don't we get the Chinese to build it?
And what sort of construction would you want, Bob?
Well, it seems to be a better construction than what they've been putting on the table in the last 20-odd years.
So you'd have Chinese workers on Chinese wages using Chinese suppliers, Chinese engineers, Chinese quantity surveyors, Chinese everything else, and get it done for
everything else, John. Yeah.
I mean, that's the issue, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Of course, you could do it for a lot less, but then you'd probably also have Chinese health and safety.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, John. Look, I've done time in Cambodia and seen the way they work there. But it just amazes me that these people can do jobs like they were saying about the highways and that. Here we are in Australia. We're still talking about a fast rail between Brisbane and Melbourne.
Yeah, because we're a democracy, Bob.
Yeah, we are. We
don't just seize people's lands and move them aside with bulldozers or put them in jail for protesting along the way.
Yes. But anyway, I still think we should ask them to build our rail network between Melbourne and Tulla.
I'll get back to Michael in a second, but Matthew from Bendigo, we're nearly out of time. Morning.
G'day, John. How you going?
Yeah, good.
Look, I just don't see. But my biggest concern with China is, as the caller said before, we don't know where the money's coming from, and currently they're looking at an acquisition of a $13 billion gas pipeline in Australia for infrastructure. I just think it should be completely denied, just on the grounds that we're selling it to a foreign entity. This is a national asset. Now, if I'm a billionaire, do you think China is going to let me buy their gas infrastructure? Do you think China is going to sell me a port? It's just not going to happen. You
can get a licence to run a casino, but then you might find if the wrong people are paid the wrong amounts or whatever it might be, then some of the staff get arrested.
Yeah. So why do we worry about upsetting China? Because they might not buy our beef, they might not buy our milk products. Ours are better than theirs. They're going to always want it.
All right.
So why do we worry about upsetting them?
Michael?
Well, we worry about upsetting them because they are enormous, and they're an enormous market. They're going to be increasingly important militarily. They are literally the elephant in the room, and we're going to have to deal with them. So, that requires diplomacy, and it's going to require some pretty delicate diplomacy, balancing the interests of the US and China, who, certainly in a trade sense, are increasingly at loggerheads.
Text messages and then we have to finish. I'm Chinese. For those of you who think the Chinese system is so good, go live there for a while and you'll see for yourself what it's really like. Gavin in Southbank says the leaders in China were children during the Great Famine, and the impacts of that experience is what drives their need for their own security. Linda says, and there's no corruption in Australia? Yeah, right. Most large corporations in the West operate through tax havens and don't pay any tax anyway, and that's corporate democracy, says Andy. When I went to Shanghai, I was astounded at the modern aspects to the city. The maglev train from the airport, bullet trains throughout the country, raised walkways. We can't even get a fast train from Melbourne to Sydney. At least communism gets it done. Democracy? Ha! And Hell's Bells has sent me a long text, which I'd have to read between now and lunchtime. China is aiming for world dominance. Just look at Australia's situation. We've been sold out by politicians and big business chasing short-term profits above quality of life for decades. And on it goes. So thank you indeed. It's been fascinating to go through this, and we're going to hear a lot more about Belt and Rail. There's no doubt about it. So your double-page spread and your time today is well spent. Thank you indeed.
Thanks very much, John.
Michael Bachelard, investigations editor and, as we've just heard, also foreign editor for the Age newspaper.